Good evening. Very nice to see you all. Those of you not sitting, sit. Those of you sitting, well disciplined. Good to see you here on time. And welcome to this particular session, which is entitled Madrid, Vilnius, Washington, Milestones for NATO's Generational Change. My name is Julian Lindley French, and it's an honor to act as moderator for this panel. Now, I posed to my team two questions. The first question is, did Vilnius deliver on Madrid? And the second question, which we'll probably have at the end, is what is the single most important takeaway that you would want from the Washington summit next year? The single thing that Washington must agree on the 75th anniversary of the foundation of our alliance. Now, I have a fantastic team to discuss these issues. David Kattler is Assistant Secretary General for Intel and Security at NATO HQ. David, that means that David will say nothing, but that's all right, David. Don't worry about it. My old friend Anna Wieslander, Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. Jeremy Shapiro. Jeremy, good afternoon, sir. Over at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Jeremy, as the rest know, you have 5 minutes. And at 4 minutes, I'll give you a warning to shut up. All right, good, very good. And we have Roderick Kieswetter. Roderick is a former colonel in the German Armed Forces and a member of the German Parliament. And last but most definitely not least, His Excellency Borut Pahor? Thank you, sir. Former President of Slovenia between 2012 and 2022. So, we'll get through the initial statements. I do want to get you involved. So do have some questions ready. Keep them short. No counter speeches, because I'll kill you if you do. Just so you understand that. Very good. Right. Without further ado, David, sir, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, yeah, I attended both the Madrid and the Vilnius summits, and I think both were great. And I think if I parallel the everlasting television series, The Office, the only question is, was it the greatest summit ever or just a great summit? But look, I joined NATO in 2019, so Vilnius was my fourth. And I really do think that the direction of political travel has been very clear, and the results of each summit have both been impressive and very useful. And I'll drill in on a few things now to give you some points. I think for many reasons, and not least of which, it was made very clear that NATO will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. And we went beyond the political statement to provide some very tangible deliverables that leaders agreed. First, they announced very substantial military support intended to enable Ukraine to prevail and remain free and sovereign. Allies also invited President Zelensky to attend. He did. And then leaders agreed to further increase NATO's package for Ukraine, to make that a multi-year effort, so to have it be demonstrably more sustainable than it would be if it were certainly agreed on a shorter, more interim basis. A good focus on increasing interoperability. And keep in mind that the package that was agreed at the summit is separate from, yet complementary to, the packages that many allies themselves have individually approved and then provided assistance to Ukraine with and through. All NATO allies are clear that Ukraine's future is in NATO and that Ukraine's place is within the Euro-Atlantic family. And I think that in itself is also one of the key political outcomes of the summit. The main focus we have collectively is to ensure that Ukraine prevails and then achieves a just and durable peace. Now, some of the technical specifics. The Defense Investment Pledge, I think, really is significant because you were in 2023 looking at a pledge that was agreed in 2014 in Wales with the idea that you had a 10-year period to get to 2%. Which could, I think, have been taken by some that 2% was a ceiling and was a goal that could be reached over that period of time where maybe you had less urgency to get there. But certainly between the Madrid and Vilnius summits, it became very clear that 2% must be the floor. And you heard that, even in just the last panel, take the comments from the Estonian defense minister, that they'll go from 3% to 3.2% next year in their budget. And that's because when allied leaders had this discussion, they also realized that there are some expenditures, some costs that must be borne by nations and allies as a whole for catch-up, for remedy of shortcomings, for additional capabilities development that is envisioned by the new family of plans. And I think that's why you will see more and more allies not just reach the 2%, but exceed the 2% target. Leaders also agreed to ensure that within that plus 2%, that they will invest at least 20% of their national defense budgets in research and development and in major equipment acquisition. And that's important also, because then you get teeth and not just tail and overhead in that. Clearly that matters today. So I think that all adds up to a real and tangible difference when you look at defense acquisition and the finances. You also saw expanded membership with Finland and soon Sweden to join the alliance as allies. That reaffirmation of Ukraine I've already covered, but also an agreement not to require a member action plan for Ukraine to join the alliance. The addition of Finland and Sweden are good for NATO. It's good certainly for those two nations, but it also fundamentally changes Baltic Sea security. And that also, I think, is a major issue for the alliance as we look to the future. Sweden, as an invitee, has a full seat at the table. They are in every NATO meeting. They are increasingly integrated into the NATO decision-making processes, into the relevant NATO bodies and panels. And that also yields great benefit as they contribute their expertise, knowledge, and experience. So I think the thing I'd summarize here is that what I took from Vilnius is that leaders recognize that you can't take security for granted, and that we have to have that collective and individual security in order to ensure our prosperity. I mean, this NATO alliance protects more than 1 billion citizens between our 31 and soon-to-be 32 allies. So it's a huge responsibility and a huge task for the alliance, and that's why I say the first thing I took was that leaders recognize that and have stepped up in their agreements.
1 minute, please,
Yep.
David.
NATO has enabled Europe and North Atlantic peace now for about 75 years. Huge accomplishment. But today is about as dangerous as any time since World War II. So the final thing I took was that leaders recognize it's even more important to stand together. And you have seen the solidarity, even since before the war. But what I would point to, the thing I'm the most proud of, is that it's not just solidarity in word, but it's been solidarity in deed. And the deeds really have mattered, both for Ukraine in the war and also for the collective security as we turn to the future.
Thank you, David. Cannot take security for granted. We stand together, word and deed are now NATO's mantra. Anna.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you to Riga Conference. It's lovely to be back here in Riga. And I would like to start with a quote. It goes like this. Right now, there are changes of the likes we have not seen in 100 years. And we are the ones driving them together. Who said this? Well, one would hope it would perhaps be President Biden talking to, the EU, von der Leyen, Michel, and Borrell, but it was not. It was Xi Jinping talking to Putin in March this year. And this is the starting point in all my thinking now, is that not since the 1930s, I believe, we have seen a threat to the global order at the level where we are right now. And security in Northern Europe is directly affected by this. And therefore, I would like to add even more a sense of urgency to the results of the Vilnius summit in two dimensions. Basically, one is deterrence and the other one is resilience. And a lot of wise things have been said already at this conference. A great start, I think, with this afternoon panels. I would like to add a few things to an already pretty long list. I think it's very urgent that Sweden becomes a full member of NATO. I know there are a lot of support for this in the alliance. And when Sweden joins NATO, I would like Sweden to actually send a battle group here to Latvia, preferably a battalion size, aiming at a brigade size when we can, but I think this would be an important contribution. To get those brigades in place here, because the enhanced forward presence matters, as I think Wallis put it. I would also like to see an enhanced forward presence in Finland, and that is not because Finland could not hold the border to Russia. I know we've been confident about that in Sweden for a long time, but the whole of the eastern flank, from the Arctic to the Black Sea, should have the same kind of confusing and complexing logic to Russia. And I think, therefore, that NATO should have perhaps US presence there, Sweden when we become a member, and so on, a few other troops. The defense industrial base has been so much pointed at. We need to go into some kind of more wartime production and rate. We are in a very urgent situation here. Readiness of troops have been mentioned. I will not address it. I would like to say a little bit about resilience. I think it has been pointed out, but it is an integrated part of deterrence. It's so extremely important. And NATO has a resilience pledge and so on. That is good, but still I worry that resilience goes into national silos too much, to a greater extent. If we look at the defense side, NATO has a defense planning process. And I would like to see a NATO resilience planning process where we actually look across borders, connect the dots. We have seen now in the Baltic Sea the connecting pipeline between two allies, Estonia and Finland, between invitee Sweden and Estonia. You know, these goes across, and we need to look at it in a more regional and overall perspective. That's a major point where I would like to see more action. And for us, I think the shift in a decade, 2014, or almost a decade now until 2023, we are already becoming first responders here. It's not like in 2014 when we looked at the US and they had to come and then we reacted a little bit. Now the troops are here, you know, lots of countries are here and we are changing the logic already. And this we need to make even stronger Europe. On the Washington summit, should we leave that for
leave that to the end?
To the end, yeah, yes. Yeah. Okay, I will leave a cliffhanger then. I would just like to say that I think there are some things there that need to be on the table, or it could rather almost be cancelled. Yes, I'll come back to it.
Thank you, Anna. Very disciplined and to the point. I'm fascinated by this idea of wartime production establishment. Before World War II, the British established a shadow factory plan where civilian industry was geared to rapidly uptake arms production in the event of war and proved very effective. Perhaps we need to look at history to see what our next steps are. Jeremy, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Great. Thanks, and thanks for having me online. I really regret that I couldn't be there in Riga, but I really appreciate the opportunity to address you in this way. Look, I didn't go to the Madrid and Vilnius summits, so I can't precisely talk in the way that David did about what was accomplished there. But I think maybe I can offer a perspective from someone who doesn't get invited to those summits, although keep in mind I would like to be invited. And I think it might be worth sort of stepping back a little bit from and thinking about the Washington perspective on NATO and Europe. It's quite interesting to think about where the Biden administration started in its foreign policy. It was very, very focused, wanted to be very focused in a way that American administrations are rarely so prioritized on China. And they had a specific and stated idea of reducing U.S. commitments and time spent on the Middle East, but also Europe. Obviously, their foreign policy has changed even in the last couple of weeks in that regard. And now there are wars that the United States and the Biden administration are not exactly participating in, but very involved in both Europe and the Middle East. And, you know, in the first instance, we can clearly understand why this is true, because it was dear boy events that intervened, as they so often do. But maybe more fundamentally, there is the point that Joe Biden is president of the United States, and it mattered that Joe Biden was president of the United States, and that even though his national security team had worked out a very sort of disciplined, prioritized idea of what U.S. foreign policy would be, and that it would be much more focused on Asia. Joe Biden is a committed transatlanticist, and he was really intent on upholding and even strengthening the U.S. commitment to NATO and to the allies in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that, I think that made all the difference. And I think I agree with David that the Biden administration has done quite a bit in this regard, an extraordinary amount in this regard, and will be committed to Ukraine and the Ukraine war as long as it takes. But of course, there won't always be a Biden administration. There may not be one in a little over a year, and there certainly won't be one in a little over 5 years. And the Ukraine war could well last that long. So it's worth thinking about why the Biden administration came into office with the policy that it did. In the first instance, this was about the threat that China poses, and it is a consensus in the United States across both parties that China is what the Pentagon calls the sizing threat. It is the peer competitor. It is a peer competitor unlike any the U.S. has ever faced, and it is going to take an incredible concentration of national resources and focus to be able to deal with that over a very long term. Secondly, there is the domestic trends in the United States, which are becoming a lot more focused on U.S. problems and a lot less focused abroad. That's very clearly symbolized by Donald Trump's America First slogan, but also, frankly, a lot of trends. Okay. 1 minute. Also, a lot of. Gotcha. Yeah. Also, a lot of trends you see in the Democratic Party. So that is not gone, I think. And Donald Trump is not going to have the same policy to the Ukraine war if he becomes president, and a future Democrat might not. So I think that what that means for the Washington summit, I won't be as much of a cliffhanger as Anna, I'm very interested to hear what she's going to say, is that really Europe needs to be stepping up into the alliance. If they want a permanent commitment to Ukraine, the United States can't provide that. And they need to be thinking in the Washington summit about how NATO can become a European alliance rather than an American alliance.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I mean, what I heard as a European is, with the best will in the world, Europe, you need to recognize that Biden won't always be there. It could be shorter, it could be longer, and that China is where the American focus is. That's an interesting challenge to Europeans. Roderick.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Julian, also for the invitation, and that you have invited a German who is known for strategic reluctance and appeasement. And therefore, I just want to answer one of your questions. Well, I'm content with the outcome of the Madrid summit, also because it was dovetailed with the European compass. But I'm really disappointed about the outcome of Vilnius, and please let me explain that. We live in an unforeseen and unparalleled simultaneity of crises, and when we look, we now have generations in responsibility who have not experienced the Cold War. So words like preparedness and readiness are unknown to them, and now we are at the proof, in times of proof. And at the Vilnius summit, I missed clear orientation and strategic communications also for the younger generations in NATO nations. Why? I see the necessity to explain what is the aim of our endeavor. Is it Ukraine becoming a buffer zone, or is it Ukraine in its borders of 1991? Is it Russia going or learning to lose? That means accepting simply the right of existing of its neighbors. There, the outcome of Vilnius was pretty unclear. And I believe if we want to convince our societies, our open societies, we must be much clearer in that. NATO is investing in public diplomacy, but it could be more in explaining that we should not protect the rule of the strongest or the might of the strongest. We need to protect the rule of law, as it was created since 1946 and always tested. But, and this is my third remark, we should be very aware that Ukraine might serve as a blueprint for other regions. So if Putin is succeeding, it might be a role model for Iran versus Iraq, for Serbia versus Kosovo and the Republika Srpska. Or we are in a war of attrition for China, including Taiwan, by a blockade or by something else, an invasion. So we Europeans need to be aware that other regions, especially in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, are looking on how we are coping with this challenge. And therefore, I see the need that NATO changes from a more or less diplomatic organization with military means to an organization of smart power. So diplomacy as well as readiness, decisiveness, and the capability to defend our own territory. And we have heard the declaration that NATO would like to defend every inch of NATO territory. Yes, but what is with those countries who would like to become part of this inch-defended country or NATO area? And I believe that the role model also for us will be Ukraine. And that means that we really must be clearer in the question of the definition of the end. And the end is to reinstall the borders of 91 and to make clear that Russia has to accept the right of existence of its neighbors. And this is the diplomatic but also military goal of this war. Because Russia never will accept the right of existence of its neighbors if we don't invest in our defense capacities. So I would like to conclude, Ukraine should not serve as a role model for Iran to go nuclear, and then for Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And it should not serve as a role model for China. You just need strategic patience and wait. And therefore, at the end, the outcome of the Washington summit, 75 years of NATO, should be the NATO membership of Ukraine must be not negotiable. It must be an reachable and tangible aim. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. NATO as an alliance of decisive power, committed to defending the rules-based order, and by definition, therefore, returning Ukraine to its 1991 borders. I mean, that's going to be a challenge, but I think we're all signed up to that. Boris, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying how historically important NATO is at this very moment, and how even more important will be for our nations and our countries in time to come. I would like to see three consensus out of the Washington summit. Number one, the consensus on the support to Ukraine. It is not up to us to push the Ukraine to seek for a peaceful, negotiations until Ukrainians and the government of Ukraine will be satisfied with the result of their, suffer to resist the Russian invasion. I am somebody who would like to see a peace, but should be a just peace. If there would be no just peace, there would be no, lasting peace. So this should be in a core of our consensus. We should support the Ukraine until the very end, and the definition of the end is in the hand of Ukrainians. Now, the second consensus should be that we should spend at least 2% for our defense spendings. You know, I became a chairman of the Social Democratic Party in mid-90s, and at that time my party opposed to a NATO membership. I changed this policy, and until then, I mean, my country, and I cannot speak now as former president on behalf of my country, have not, you know, have not done the job with this 2% commitment. But I think the time has come to change this mentality. It's not our obligation, it's our right to be there with our, you know, with our financial assistance, with everybody else, than to feel safe. You know, we are now in a time when the security is back on the agenda. Who would think a couple of years ago, or maybe 10, 15 years ago, that we will talk about our security in the future? Unfortunately, the time is come to see that everybody is responsible for our common security. So also small countries as Slovenia has to fulfill the obligation. So consensus number one, to support Ukraine. The consensus number two, to fulfill the obligation as far as the defense spending is concerned. And I think the consensus number three is to go with the enlargement process, not just to Ukraine and to Moldova, but also to Western Balkans, if there would be a political will to go. And I would like to finish by saying that NATO has been so important for the stability in Western Balkans because has had this vision of enlargement much more than the European Union. So, you know, with Albania, with Montenegro, and with North Macedonia as members of NATO, the peace and stability there is much more strong than it used to be without the NATO membership. So I have very high expectations out of the Washington summit, because I think there is a common sense at this very moment among our people that we should be together, you know, in political sense, in sense of security, in sense of economy. We are belonging to the West. The West has its own values. We have to defend those values, and we have to defend them together.
Thank you, Boris. That is extremely eloquent and clear about what you expect from DC. Consensus over our support for Ukraine. Very clear. Spend at least 2% on defence and complete the enlargement process. And on that last note, I have been warned by 3 very senior people in the Western Balkans over the last few days how dangerous the situation is. We cannot afford to take our eye off that region, particularly at this moment in time. Right, we have 15 minutes for questions, and I mean questions. So the way we normally do this is you come to these microphones. But if our colleagues here can get microphones to you, all the better. Madam, in the middle there, followed by you, sir. Klaus.
Thank you, Julian. Hannah Shellest, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism.
Great, good to see you.
Glasses, that's why I put it there. Brief question. What we definitely missed in Madrid and Vilnius was a vision of NATO as the maritime power and any real projection. The threats within 2 years increased, not only because of Russia in Europe, but also China in the maritime domain. Your projection, can we see more decision in the maritime domain for NATO in Washington?
Thank you. I'll take a second question as well. So, microphone here, please. Could you pass it sort of over the heads?
Klaus Wittmann. I have a question for my compatriot Roderich Kiesewetter, who in his last remark talked about increasing the defense capabilities. I found a very nice quote by the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, who said of the 1848 revolution in Germany, Germany history reached a turning point, but it failed to turn. Now, in a foreign country, I will not invite you for Germany bashing, but I would like to ask very soberly, what must be the next steps in the proclaimed Zeitenwende for the Bundeswehr to become as capable as it was during the Cold War? And one remark about
very quick, Klaus.
If I may,
I know your method.
If I may, the formula, we will help Ukraine as long as it takes, I have written and said many times, must be complemented by, with everything that is needed and in a timely fashion.
Thank you, sir. Very good. Roderick, I'm going to give you the chance to respond to that question about Zeitenwende, and anybody else in the maritime domain. David, then comes you. Yeah. Roderick, please.
Yes, very brief. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as regards the turning point or Zeitenwende, I believe that as regards the military field, it is already history, because the 100 billion euros were not yet fully invested. We lost about 20 billion euros for interest rates and inflation. And in the armed forces, there are about 3 billion euros already invested and 66 billion euros for the next years. However, to make our armed forces capable, you need much more money, much more budget for exercises. You need much more procurement, and you need to build up the capabilities for a credible defense of our country and credible defense of the alliance. That means additional brigades, additional squads, and also the question, how do we cooperate, especially with the Netherlands and the navies in the Baltic Sea, for delineated tasks. So where could we support with submarines, but we need a better delineation of what every country can do. But what I would like to underline is that the basic idea of Zeitenwende was, first of all, a shift of paradigm in the now ruling Chancellor's Party, which was really successful because they were against the 2% goal, they were against modernizing of nuclear sharing. All this has gone. So this Zeitenwende is achieved. But the other idea was that our Chancellor did not believe in Ukraine to withstand the Russian aggression. So the German belief was, also in my party, CDU, that Ukraine might fail within weeks and then the Russian troops stand at the border to Romania and to the Baltic states. This is not the case, and therefore Zeitenwende will then take place if we finally, a sigh of relief, I hope, in a year, achieve the change of our culture, of our attitude, that we invest in not only our defense capabilities, but that our country knows that we cannot only be receivers of security, we need to create a common European approach. I'm very hopeful after the elections in Poland, that Poland, France, Germany and United Kingdom address the United States on behalf of the whole European Union and European NATO member states and say we want a fair burden sharing. The Americans invest 2/3 in the support of Ukraine and the Europeans 1/3. And it's on the European soil. And if we want to avoid that Ukrainians leave their country with displaced persons and with huge numbers of migrants, then we need to give them a perspective. And this perspective must be a dovetailed approach. Yeah.
Thank you. A couple of words of advice. Do not use the word common in the UK. Just
doesn't matter. We are not in the UK.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my second word of advice, buy British submarines. They're brilliant and very reasonably priced.
Yeah.
They also have to be nuclear power, but you can get over that. David.
They changed 2+4 treaties.
Well, I don't know. You can buy submarines from the US also. So it may be good there.
Oh, yeah.
But can you get nuclear submarines in Sweden?
No, but they're quiet and the best.
Okay.
And very price-worthy.
So to your question about maritime forces, look, a couple of things I'd point out. I think first, After this expansion of Russia's illegal war against Ukraine in February of 2022, it wasn't just land forces and air forces and air defenses that NATO moved, but also ships as well into the Baltic Sea and into the Mediterranean. Allies did send additional ships, planes, and troops to Eastern Europe. You saw us move 4 more multinational battle groups as well: Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. So you got thousands more troops, more jets, for more air policing. You also got more maritime forces and increased readiness and capability then as a result. To go back to the précis of this particular panel, I'd also tell you that that builds on the success from both Madrid and Vilnius in the new NATO force model. And so just something, I'm going to just skip to my punchline here and say that what's been able to happen is that as leaders also agreed to this new generation, this new family of plans, we have the new force model to ensure that you've got the right capabilities and the right numbers already pre-allocated, if not forward staged. And that gave us the ability to move those forces in place quite quickly. So I think you get a lot of focus, for reasons as a former Navy man I don't understand, on land forces, but I would tell you that the naval forces were also involved in that and were moved quite quickly and can do so in the future as we react to various contingencies.
Thank you, David. You actually have the Scottish National Party for the Royal Navy's biggest shipbuilding programme since World War II. And the reason is because all the ships were built in Scotland, which means that it rather takes away the idea they might want to leave. So there's positive outcomes. Next, madam, down the front here, please. Coming this way, coming this way.
Irina Kuznetsova, I'm serving on the board of NATO. I have a question to a guest from Germany. Germany has been installing quite a lot Huawei telecommunication 5Gs, and I read recently that you have been warned by Americans that they will stop sharing intelligence because they consider this as a security risk. Don't you think that this might be in the future, or your over-reliance on Huawei infrastructure might be a security risk in the same mistake as you did with over-reliance on Russian gas? Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, please.
Yeah.
Take that question.
Very brief. The last government has delayed the process of IT law in our parliament to give our national IT communications the chance to find the most appropriate devices. However, they were very oriented on costs, and therefore they procured Huawei and ZTE devices. The current government is now exchanging this with a huge endeavor. Nevertheless, we have a challenge regarding the Hamburg harbor, the port of Hamburg, where some terminal was sold in a minority sell-out to China, to Chinese Costco. So we have already mitigated the challenge in 5G, but not yet the challenge regarding our door to the world, the port of Hamburg harbor.
Thank you very much. Madam there. Can we get the mic? Thank you. Put your hand up, please.
Thank you. Clearly, Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake. How can we prevent Black Sea from becoming a Russian lake, or even more so, a lake in which competitors such as China are getting more present? And here, I think we also should mention the fact that China is going to build a Black Sea port in Anaklia, having also Georgia as a strategic partner since a few months ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy, do you want to have a shot at that? Jeremy?
No, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't think I have a lot of words of wisdom on that. I don't think that NATO, I don't think that the Black Sea is going to be a Russian lake because Turkey is there. Turkey is technically part of NATO, but I think in this regard, it probably can't be considered. It won't be a sort of force augmenter for NATO in the Black Sea. But I think that the balance of forces in the Black Sea is such that the Russians really won't be able to dominate there. But I also don't think that NATO will, and I think we'll have to live with contestation in the Black Sea and the possibilities of escalation in the Black Sea for quite some time. And I think that that might be more the paradigm that we want to think about instead of one or the other side being able to dominate it.
I would go further. I think we have to look at the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and that entire region, including Georgia, countries that are aspirants both to NATO and EU membership. But what we need is a plan, a very clear plan, about how we are indeed going to engage in a very contested space. Anybody else on the panel want to respond to that?
Well, I'll just say, who says we don't have a plan?
Ah,
Right? I mean, I just said, the leaders just approved a pretty broad range, a new family, a new generation of a family of plans in Vilnius that built upon a lot of the work and the discussion that were taken in Madrid. I'm not going to give them any classified information, but what I would say is, I push back on the idea that it's a tit-for-tat NATO, that the Baltics, because of the great number of NATO allies that are on the Baltic Sea, it makes it a NATO lake, therefore Russia gets the Black Sea, is in no way correct. In fact, as you know, there are a great number of NATO allies on the Black Sea. As mentioned, Turkey, you also have Bulgaria and Romania, and you have Georgia as a NATO partner on the other side. They all have sovereign territory, and that is in fact part of the territory that NATO has sworn to protect every square inch of. So I don't think there's a direct line. Russia had engaged in a creeping militarization of the Black Sea before the war that had already taken our attention, and there were already a great number of actions that were taken to introduce patrols, air and maritime, to have more capability on a permanent basis in the Black Sea, and I don't think that's going to change after the war is over.
Anna.
I could just add that when Ukraine wins, you know, there will be even more allies in control in the Black Sea.
Exactly right.
Do we include the Arctic, by the way, in this broad Baltic, Black Sea, Arctic? Because the Arctic is going to be a contested space as well.
Yes, and some part it already is, but I think that's one important point, that when we look at all these spaces, and the plans, I think, also cover this space from at least parts of the Arctic and down to the Black Sea, and that's how Russia sees it. It's one strategic field on their part. So if we are to meet one adversary, these have to be at least linked together. We have to have a whole situational awareness going.
Roderick.
Yeah, thank you. Very brief. I believe the key to avoid that the Black Sea becomes a kind of Russian lake is to enable Ukraine to regain Crimea, because who owns Crimea owns that Black Sea. That's the key.
I'm going to kill the questions now because I want to give my panel time to consider the DC challenge, the Washington Summit challenge. I know exactly what I want out of Washington. For too long, the NATO defense planning process has been one of the great works of European fiction, where we promise to fulfill our obligations, and frankly, as Ben Wallace said, we don't. And not only that, the NATO defense planning process itself has to be modernized to cope with the emerging and disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, synthetic biology, nanotechnologies, which will enter the battle space in the next 10 to 15 years and radically change the character, if not the nature of war. Washington has got to address this, and that will be my test for whether the summit is a success. But in reverse order of speaking, Borat first, what's going to be your test for the success of the Washington summit?
Number one, to keep consensus on Ukraine. Number two, to see Ukraine as a next member of NATO alliance. And number three, the consensus that the defense spending is not a technical issue. It's a highly political issue.
Yeah.
We should come together and say, sorry, but our security is at stake, and we should make our best to keep our society safe. So we should invest in, in the security. I think we should work on this consensus. Will not be, there for granted. We should approach our people and say, look, the world is as it is. We are together. Let us do the work together. And I think that would, you know, in a way, give some sort of hope that we will survive with our values.
Thank you. Roderick.
I completely align with that, what you just have said. The key is how to achieve this consensus. And therefore, I believe that NATO needs a new credibility, giving orientation, and being backboned by societies who believe in this power of NATO. And the second is that there is a unanimous support that for further negotiations in the future, the NATO membership of Ukraine is not negotiable. It's a given. And the third is, this is more philosophical, that we do not tolerate a situation where the power of the strength or the right of the strongest prevails over the power of law and the might of right. I believe we should invest also in that.
Thank you, sir. Jeremy.
Thanks. Well, I guess if we're doing our wish list, mine is that Europeans stand up at the 75th anniversary summit and declare that that they are going to take responsibility for European security, supported, of course, by the United States, but no longer led by the United States. And I think, as Roderick mentioned, there is a real opportunity. I think this is obviously not going to happen, but frankly, most of the things that we've said are not going to happen. But I think that there is nonetheless an opportunity in the new Polish government, as Roderick said, to be working with the UK and France in the next year, in the period before the US election, because of course Donald Trump could be president during the Washington summit, well, it's not right, but soon, to really divine how this could happen. And I wouldn't exempt Germany from that, Roderick. I think Germany would be a very essential part of that.
Thank you. Anna.
Yes. Well, I have 1 extra minute, I think, because I was short in my former one. So I will add, the easy thing, I think, is the one-pager to Congress, which I think the Europeans really need to deliver. And that should have, I think, 3 major points. One is the 2%, that basically we are achieving it. Try really hard to make that look as good as possible, and that it is the floor, not the ceiling. Secondly, that Europe is contributing with troops. I mean, there's 300,000 troops. A lot of them can still be European, and that we are working on the readiness and mobilization of these troops. I think that's a very important message, some kind of pledge, perhaps. And then thirdly, that we are also, Europe is also equipping itself, procuring, and a lot of it is American. That's also, of course, a message that is important for Congress. So this one, don't lose that opportunity, of course, as Europe, to convince US that it is in their interest to continue to support Europe. But having said that, I said, you know, I think there is one thing that perhaps might ruin it all, and I think that is Ukraine. I started with this quote on who's driving change. And I think the West needs to be more courageous and realize that if we are not on top of driving change, someone else definitely is. And the future of Ukraine is part of this. So we cannot have a summit where we say Ukraine will be a member of NATO. We said it in Bucharest, we said it in Vilnius. This cannot be the third part when we don't go further than that. To my mind, President Biden and the whole of NATO needs to have some kind of wording around an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO at this point. In my mind, link it to conditions on the ground, something that has happened that make this possible, that clearly signals that we believe Ukraine can win and should win, and it should be the whole of Ukraine. That is what we want, and the fear of all the rest should be by then eliminated. A clear message, or else I don't think there should be basically a Washington summit.
Thank you, Anna. Very clear. David.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'll come at it as well from a personal, and I think a more, a little bit less technical perspective. And I'd say, look, first let's remember context. There are great expectations for every summit, but this is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Alliance, and this summit will be held in the city of its founding. So there are, I think, some additional emotional and historical expectations about this alliance. So I think it's important then that the agenda actually live up to that framing, even if it's a little unfair. I think it is important that we do that. What I would suggest that's not been said is that we focus on values, value-driven policy and value-driven communication. And not to ourselves, not to the leaders in the room, not to the ministers who will support them, but to our publics that will hear of the messages that are communicated that come out of that summit. And what I mean specifically here, to kind of end on, I think on the right note, is we should be very deliberate to communicate the continued and future relevance, value, and power of the NATO alliance on a human level to a point that my American family understands it and accepts it and votes for it, and that our publics in each of the allies do the same, because it is critically important that they do so for all the reasons that we've on this panel and the ministers that preceded us in the previous panel have discussed. So what I would suggest is that the summit be considered as not just for us, meaning national security professionals, the politicians in the room, but for the people in our nations and in those nations that aspire to join this great alliance because they share the values and they wish to live in freedom enjoying them. I think that would be a huge accomplishment for the summit.
Thank you, David. In a sense, you give me a great outro, which is, I would challenge all of us as Europeans to ask ourselves a question. We're sitting in a room as a guest of a family in Columbus, Ohio. They pay for much of NATO, and they're curious about our alliance, but know not much about it. How would we say, what would we say to them as Europeans? Why should they go on paying for our European defence? What's going to win that argument? I take the point from colleagues that values matter, and we can talk about shared values. But they might say, well, hold on a minute, we've been paying for much of those values over the last 75 years. And my response would be, okay, by 2030, we Europeans will share at least 50% of the cost of the alliance, field 50% of the forces. We will be able to put in the field an allied mobile heavy force that can engage at the highest level of conflict that is interoperable with US forces, specifically so we can ease the pressure on the United States so that we Europeans help keep America strong where America needs to be. That's the message we Europeans have got to give at DC. And if Jeremy's right, none of this happens, then I really wonder whether NATO will be around in a substantive form in the next 10, 15 years. I'd like you to join me in thanking my outstanding panel for their contribution.